MMA fans have a high tolerance for violence and gore, but even for us, these 10 injuries shook us to the core. Whether they were inflicted by an opponent or just a freak accident, every fighter accepts the risks. But sometimes what happens in the cage goes a bit too far. These injuries are not for the faint of heart. They had long-lasting effects on athletes' careers, and even their life after they hung up their gloves. Here are the snaps, the splits, and swell-ups that remind us just how dangerous the sport actually is. Here are the top 10 most disturbing injuries in MMA history. Joanna Jędrzejczyk's first fight with Zhang Weili for the UFC strawweight title might just be the single greatest fight in the history of women's MMA. It was a wild, blood and guts affair that showcased two living legends pushing each other to their absolute limits. But for Joanna, watching her forehead slowly get pounded into an unrecognizable mess is probably the image that sticks in your memory. The hematoma that the former champ was left with was as bad as any we've ever seen. She looked like an alien by the time Zhang was done with her. And sure, compared to some of these other injuries, Joanna healed up pretty quickly. But in terms of the eye test alone, this one was bad. Speaking of hematomas, how about the deformed eye of Matt Mitrione after his loss to Travis Browne? The official record will tell you that a clean punch caused this monstrosity of an injury, but two previous eye pokes from Browne clearly did not help matters. Mitrione seriously looked like he had a golf ball shoved underneath his skin. This is yet another example of an injury that even the most hard-nosed MMA fans can't help but cringe at the sight of. Alistair Overeem had seemingly done everything right coming into the final seconds of his showdown with Jairzinho Rozenstruik. It was a veteran performance, and one that could well have catapulted the Reem back into title contention at heavyweight. But in the dying embers of the bout, Jairzinho struck, and it was the perfect shot. He managed to knock out Overeem with no time to spare, winning the fight in the 5th round's last seconds. In the process, he also just so happened to leave Alistair's lip in a disgusting mess. Seriously, that image of Overeem's terribly split lip remains in our heads to this day. Mike Perry is as tough as they come, and he's not gonna let an absolutely obliterated nose get in the way of him finishing the fight. And in there, with the similarly game Vicente Luque, they were always gonna produce fireworks. But when Luque nailed Perry right on the old sniffer with a flying knee, there is a good chance that 90% of fighters would have had their spirits broken. But Perry is definitely not cut from that cloth. And so he fought on and proceeded to laugh off the injury like it was nothing. Big Nog vs Frank Mir was a true grappler's matchup, a fight that would leave one of these men with a claim to being the best submission artist in the division. Big Nog took this narrative quite seriously, and so after hurting Mir on the feet, instead of playing it safe and pounding him out for a TKO, he decided to go for the choke. But here's the problem. Even though Frank was dazed, he wasn't out, and in an instant he reversed position and ended up on top, cranking on Big Nog's arm in this now legendary Kimura. Nogueira's pride wouldn't let him tap, and so Mir snapped his limb, winning the fight in crazy fashion. MMA is the type of sport where things can go horribly wrong incredibly fast, and for Estela Nunes, what could have been a competitive or even a victorious performance was totally ruined when her elbow decided to totally cave in on itself. Seriously, once it was dislocated, she was left in total agony, with her mangled limb left useless by her side. Thankfully, no further damage was done, but this fight was proof that injuries can really happen in the most rapid and random of ways. Michael Bisping had the misfortune of coming up against a heavily roided up Vitor Belfort as he surged towards middleweight title contention. Back in those days, the fans used to call him TRT Vitor due to the new lease of life he got after a loophole in anti-doping laws allowed him to pump himself full of testosterone. And TRT Vitor was a terrifying sight, so when he head-kicked Bisping into oblivion, it wasn't that shocking. What was shocking was that Bisping's retina detached as a result, which eventually led to him losing his eye. Yes, that's right, the Count went on to win UFC middleweight gold with one working eye. It's a great shame that one of the greatest strikers to ever grace the octagon lost his final ever UFC title fight due to a leg break, but Anderson Silva's legendary run had to come to an end at some point. Okay, sure, Chris Weidman had already beaten and finished him at this point, but seeing the Spider fall back on his own broken limb was basically the final nail in the coffin of his high-level MMA career. The irony, though, came years later when Weidman himself suffered a near-identical fate, snapping his own leg in there with Uriah Hall. But perhaps the most brutal example of all was when the late Corey Hill's leg gave out in his fight with Dale Hart. That one is still difficult to watch. Ruptured ear, anyone? Well, Leslie Smith suffered this incredibly cruel fate in there with Jessica Eye, taking a shot right on the ear that caused her cauliflower to literally squirt blood. A ruptured ear TKO was definitely not on anyone's bingo card for that event, and yet that's exactly what happened. The doctor took one look at the extent of the damage to her ear and decided to call it off there and then. Just when we thought MMA injuries couldn't get any worse, Dylan Raichman comes along and absolutely destroys his leg after a takedown attempt. Seriously, he didn't just break any old bone either. No, he fractured his femur, and you can see the thing snap right in front of your eye. Who knows if he's just the owner of the worst luck in the history of the sport, or a legitimately brittle bone. But thankfully, he was back to training 1 year after this horrific injury. 16 months later, he returned to the cage with a first-round victory by way of rear naked choke. But what do you think is the single worst injury in MMA history? And did we leave anything off our list? Let us know in the comments section. Enjoy this video? Well, why don't you support the channel by hitting that subscribe button and checking out some of our other uploads? Thanks for watching.